Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Colossians. We're still in Colossians chapter 4. Today we start reading at verse 15. Now we're to the last few verses of this letter. Paul is almost done. The last few sessions we've been looking at the greetings he sends to the Colossians from those who are with him in Rome. Now there are a number of people associated with Paul in Rome, aiding him while he is in prison there, still doing ministry, and they send their greetings to the Colossians. He's talked about each of them in turn. But now as verse 15 begins, he sends his greetings to the church in Colossae and to certain people around that area. That's what he says in verse 15. Give my greetings to the brothers and sisters at Laodicea, and to Nympha and the church in her house. Now this is the second time the church in Laodicea has been mentioned. And then when we get to verse 16, he'll mention this church again. So 3 times in chapter 4, Paul mentions the church in Laodicea. Now I've already said that Laodicea was a village or a small town close to Colossae. And there's a lot of communication and interaction between the two villages or the two towns and between the two churches. So the believers in Colossae are well acquainted with the believers in Laodicea and have communication back and forth. Probably, as we've already mentioned, both churches were founded by Epaphras. But anyway, Paul says, be sure and give greetings to the church in Laodicea as well. I've given greetings to you, Colossae believers, but I want to be sure that the Laodicean believers know I'm giving greetings to them as well. And also give greetings to the lady named Nympha and the church in her house. Now, we don't know who this Nympha was. We just know that she was a woman in Laodicea. She was a believer. She was a follower of Jesus Christ. And one of the congregations in Laodicea met in her home. Now remember, in New Testament times, and indeed for the first few centuries of Christian history, the Christian church did not have church buildings. The Christians only began to build public buildings for worship about the 300s. 3 centuries after the movement began, after the death and resurrection of Jesus. In those first few centuries, they met in the homes of their members. So when you would go to a city or a village or a town, and you were looking for the Christians there, you would not look for a public building called the church. You would just search for where the believers met. Normally the wealthier members of the church who had larger homes would provide their homes as gathering places for the church. And Nympha was obviously such a person. She had some means, worldly means. She was more wealthy than most. And so she had a larger home and provided her home as a place where the church in Laodicea could meet. And so Paul very specifically sends his greetings to the church in Laodicea that meets in her home. It's just interesting for us to remember that for the first few centuries of Christian history, Christianity was a home movement, a church home movement. Now in verse 16, Paul mentions Laodicea again. He says, after this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and also that you in turn read the letter from Laodicea. So Paul wants them to understand that the letter he is sending to the Colossians, make sure the Laodiceans get a copy of it as well. Make a copy, send it to them so that they can read it as well and benefit from it. And also Paul says, I have sent a letter to Laodicea. You read that as well. So obviously there were at least 2 letters being sent, one to Colossae, which is preserved for us here, and one to Laodicea, which we don't have. They were individual letters to those churches, but they were to be read by the other churches as well. And by the way, this is how a lot of the scripture came to us. A lot of the scripture from Romans onward is letters that Paul and other apostles wrote to the churches and other Christians. And those letters were preserved because they were so important, and they were kept and read by other churches as well. And eventually all the church recognized that these letters, these gospels also written telling about Jesus, these were scripture, and so they were preserved as holy scripture. Unfortunately for us, we do not have the letter of Laodicea that was written to that church. It was not preserved for whatever reason. Probably because as the Spirit directed, it was not to be considered scripture, but it was a letter that they received. And so the Colossians were to read the Laodicean letter, and the Laodiceans were to read the Colossian letter. So Paul makes sure to mention that to them. Says, read each other's letters because they have important information for all of you. Now, tomorrow's session, Paul has a couple more verses, a couple more things to say. So we're just real close to wrapping up Colossians. So join us next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Colossians.